Well, here we are at the Rethinking Hell Conference. I got to tell you, I am so excited to be speaking at this conference. I got to speak last year in Seattle, Washington, and hang out with Paul Copan and Clay Jones and Chris Date and several others, and got to see Tim Barnett speak, and I just loved that. And this year to be coming back as a speaker again. The only sad thing about it is that because it's online, that means that I don't get to hug your neck, see you face to face, shake your hand, have those side conversations that are so powerful. But I love the Rethinking Hell Conference, and this year's theme is so spot on because we are talking about what's going on in the world today. And I have to say, much of this is going to be specific to America, although comments are going to be relevant for the whole world in one way or the other as we go through this. But from our context, it's clear, even in the United States, that we are living in a day and age in which people are yearning for justice. We see it with the claims of inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality. We talk about the treatment of African Americans by police. We see all this going on with the trans community and all this outcry for some sort of justice. We've seen it on the news as we've seen the trials lately of Ahmaud Arbery and Glen Maxwell and Kyle Rittenhouse and Jesse Smollett, all these people, and the pickets outside of the courthouses show us that people are yearning for justice, but in a specific way. They're yearning for judgment. That's a part of how you get justice. And they want judgment done to whoever they consider to be the evil or wrongdoing party here. But it shows us that we live in a world, whichever side of these issues you're on, we're living in a world that is yearning for judgment. We're also living in a world that is yearning for life. Here we are, 2 years into this worldwide pandemic, and as far as I can tell, no end in sight. We see new variants popping up every now and then, and we have these medications, these vaccines that have been out there, and people are arguing over this. People are very concerned about this, and as of this past Tuesday, 5.41 million worldwide deaths because of COVID. The reason people are so fascinated with this, that though in the first few weeks after the pandemic began, we thought that the news would stop being so inundated with just this almost all the time. But here we are 2 years later, and it's still going on. Why is it on the news all the time? Why is it we're talking about it? Well, surely there can be political posturing and ways that people try to use the COVID pandemic. But at base, this is an illness. And illnesses, diseases, things like this, viruses, can end life. It threatens life. And as a result of that, people are yearning for judgment, yearning for life, yearning for health. And they're yearning for some kind of a trajectory. We saw this last year and at the beginning of this year. I'm speaking still within 2021 if you're seeing this a few days later. And we saw people arguing and polarized over who the president should be. Well, big deal, Braxton. People always argue over who the president should be. There's always more than one candidate. Yeah, that's true. But in this case, we saw something that was absolutely unparalleled. We saw protests, and we saw what happened on January 6th, and we saw with the storming of the Capitol, we saw people absolutely divided over which candidate they think represents progress, let's say, the best. They're looking for someone, a leader who can set them on a trajectory, set us on a trajectory toward progress. They're yearning for all of these things. And in the midst of this, we're at a conference where people might look at this and say, and you guys are going to talk about hell? Yeah, that's disappointing. You Christians are just adding insult to injury. I don't think so. I don't think that's the case. I actually think the subject of this conference points to a solution that brings genuine, real, bona fide good news to our world and directly addresses many of the issues facing our country and our world right now. So we're going to jump into that, and we're going to look at this. And one of the things that I want to do is to give you hopefully something that you can take away from this video, from this conference, and actually put to use in having conversations with people. And so we're going to try to do that. Jonathan Pritchett said to me just not too long ago, or said at the conference we had in Dallas just a few weeks ago, he said, if Christians would take the effort they put into political discussions and put them into this sort of thing, then we would be able to witness far beyond what we ever thought possible. And so I'm going to give you a way to talk to people about what's going on in the world that I think drives everything back to the cross, back to the truth of the Christian message, and actually makes sense of even makes sense of things beyond these cultural issues that are going on right now. Now, I'm a weird dad at this point. I don't know if you're a weird dad out there. Surely you've got some other weird dads. And when I was younger, my daughter thought that I was cool and all my jokes were funny. Now she thinks I'm lame and all my jokes are weird dad jokes. So I'm gonna do a weird dad kind of thing. Just bear with me. It's a little cheesy, but this is a good way of remembering things. I like acrostics. You know what an acrostic is? It's a word where you have each letter of that word stands for something else. So if you can remember the word, you can remember what all the letters stand for. You can remember a case for whatever, or a way to have a conversation about something, or all the facts related to whatever. And so that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to give you a word, and what I want you to do, if you're taking notes on a piece of paper or on a note-taking app on your phone or computer, I just want you to make notes vertically down the left-hand side of your page, down your left-hand side of the page. And the reason I want you to do that is I want you to put each letter of the word I'm about to give you and leave space between each of those letters so that you can take notes, and then when you get done, hopefully by the time we're done, I will have given you a way to go out and have these kind of important conversations in a way that is very Christian and drives people to true and lasting hope. So here's what we're going to do. The word is just, because I think that God's justice is a great answer to what's going on in the world today, and also is that nexus of talking about what's going on in the world today and talking about the afterlife, specifically hell. And so we're gonna talk about all of these things. And the letter J in just stands for judgment. Judgment. Now, the Bible talks about God's judgment and doesn't not necessarily talk about it as a bad thing. Now, it might be unpleasant to experience, but it's not intrinsically a bad thing. It is good for God to do what God does, and if God brings judgment, that's a good thing. Exodus 6:6 says, "Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments." Genesis 18:25 says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" So there are going to be judgments, the Bible teaches. We're going to have to confront that. We're going to face that, or we're going to face it. Yeah, we're going to face judgments of all sorts. But when God looks on wicked people and judges them, that's not intrinsically a bad thing. The judge of all the earth will do right. He is the judge, after all. This is the biblical teaching. Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "The conclusion when all has been heard is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil." So the judgment of God is a terrifying thing, depending on your posture, depending on where you are with respect to God. But at the same time, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. What God does is a good thing. Now, our culture is a bit conflicted on this point, honestly. Debates persist over retributive justice. On the other hand, our culture wants justice. So let's begin with a simple exercise. Now, you might not know this, but in the internet world where I live, where I do much of my ministry, there is what is known as Godwin's Law. I don't know if you know what Godwin's Law is, or sometimes called Godwin's Law of Nazi analogies, it's sometimes called, and hell and all this sort of thing. But I don't think we actually think so. You may think your intuitions drive you to that, but I don't think they do. Think about this with me for just a moment. What if we were successful in capturing Adolf Hitler and he hadn't committed suicide? What should we do? What should the rest of the world's governments do? How should we treat this? Should we hug him? Just pat him on the back and say, "Hey, we know life's hard. You made mistakes. Just don't do it again now. Just don't do it again. But we love you." Is that what we should do? Well, we should love our enemies, but no, actually, what we should do is we should bring judgment. There is a price to be paid. There is a penalty for the things that he did. There's a penalty for sin. And as a result, it would be wrong, it would be immoral not to bring judgment on someone like Adolf Hitler. I think that the world would absolutely, just look at what's gone on with these trials lately and all that sort of thing. Think about George Floyd. Think about what the world wanted to happen after that. At least much of the world. When the verdict came in on Glen Maxwell, for example, my wife and I were watching it on the news. There were 40 hours spent in deliberation by the jury. And my wife said out loud, this is the woman who had helped to procure girls to take them to the predator, Jeffrey Epstein. And 40 hours of deliberation over these charges. Now, I think it's great that we have people who are being very cautious, but the first thing out of my wife's mouth was, why did it take 40 hours? And the reason she said that is because it's so obvious that this woman is guilty. But at the same time, whether you feel that way or not, the point is her response illustrated that she wants judgment to be brought swiftly. She wants something to be done. She can't stand in the face of such injustice, particularly to young people like that. And so this shows that we see judgment as a good and important thing. Now, the problem is we don't always respond to it the way that is best, because we're not perfect. When we try to bring judgment or avenge ourselves, let's say, on someone else, this is why vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. We will mess it up. First of all, we're not the just judge, the perfect and right judge. And because of that, we will mess it up. Several years ago, I was speaking at a church in Jacksonville, Florida. And the next day, my wife and I were going to get up and leave town. We're going to drive back home to Indiana. And that night before we left the next day, she came upstairs from going downstairs to get a drink. And she said, I don't know how to tell you this. There was a man down there who was hitting on me. And I said, where is he? And she said, well, I don't want you to do anything about it. And I said, where is he? And so she told me he's in the lobby. So I went downstairs and I went into the lobby and I didn't see the guy. But the next day, as we were getting ready to leave, packing up the car and everything, there was like a conference room off the lobby. Sometimes you see that with a window. And I could see that there were some guys in there having a conference about something. And so I walked over to Sarah and I said to her, do you see the guy that hit on you last night? And she said, I don't want to tell you. And her face turned red. She said, Braxton, let's just not do this. Let's just go. Don't embarrass me. And I said, point to him. And she pointed. I went over to the door of the room, opened it. I didn't just walk through the door all nice. I appeared in the doorway. And I said, are you the man who was hitting on my wife last night? And about that time, the head muckety-muck who was behind the table, he stood up, not the guy that I was accusing. And he said, that man hasn't been here. He just got here this morning. You can't accuse him. And I said, you just sit down and let me talk to this guy. I couldn't believe I said it. And I said, are you the one who was hitting on my wife last night? And he just grinned at me. And that just made it worse. And I said, well, let me tell you something. If you hit on my wife, there's going to be a penalty to pay for that. Now, I didn't realize when I said it at the time, but that coming from an individual and one who is not the law, let's say, that sounded a little bit like a threat. And so the head muckety-muck waddled up to his feet again and called for security. Well, I didn't know what kind of security they had at the Hollywood Holiday Inn and Suites, but I wasn't going to stay and find out. So I grabbed Sarah, grabbed our stuff, got in the car, and we took off. And man, I didn't exceed the speed limit, but I came real close. And I was cutting a trail out of Jacksonville, Florida, because you see, I was just sure that the police were after me for my threat, that I had broken the law by making a threat, and I was on the run, and it was going to look like O.J. Simpson with all the police cars behind me eventually. Well, that never happened. And got out of that situation, and I looked over at my wife and I said, but aren't you glad that you've got a man? And be honest, does it kind of get you excited that you've got a man like that who will take up for your honor? And she said, well, that's very exciting. And I do appreciate that you did that. And I said, what? She said, I don't want to tell you. I said, you got to tell me. She said, I don't want to tell you. And I said, you got to tell me. And she said, all right, I did appreciate that. And it was amazing to see you do that. But you were accusing the wrong guy. And now, when I think about this, what crosses my mind is I tried to enact some sort of a judgment, but I'm flawed. I'm imperfect. Well, guess what? It might have been better if I was the police or if I was some judge and I was enacting judgment somewhere. But our courts, our law enforcement, they do the best they can. I believe they try to do the best they can. But the fact is they're not perfect judges either. They aren't perfect juries. And so as a result of that, we got big problems when it comes to judgment, but people crave judgment. They're looking for a perfect judge to judge evil, and we've got that for them. Yes, it involves hell, however you understand hell. Yes, it can involve heaven, the afterlife, all those sorts of things. But the reality is this piece of the puzzle that actually points toward the nature of hell at some point is actually a piece of the puzzle for confronting our culture with something that can't be resolved, not by any nation, not by any man, not by any king, not by any woman, not by anyone of any race. The only way this is resolved is with a perfect judge who stands before us all. Now, I'll tell you this. This idea that we're discussing right now about God's justice and love can actually be really helpful, even for you as a believer just looking at your Bible on your own. It's helpful for me in apologetics. Now, we're not necessarily doing strictly apologetics here at this conference, but I've done quite a bit of apologetics over the years, and I run an apologetics channel, and I teach apologetics at a seminary. And when I think about there's a lot going on. People say all kinds of things about Canaan in the Old Testament and the charge for Moses and Joshua to conquer the Canaanites and all that sort of thing. And Joshua goes in. And when we look at that, I hear this on a daily, if not a daily, at least a weekly, multiple times a week, I hear this. And that is that this is wicked. How could God command this sort of an action? But when we look in Scripture, we find out that I realize that the Israelites going in and waging war with these other countries and driving them out and killing people and all that sort of thing, I understand how that sounds. I'm not new to this at all. I get why that strikes us as not representing prima facie, why it doesn't seem to modern ears in our drywalled, air-conditioned environment, why that doesn't seem very loving. It seems kind of rough. Well, there's no question it was rough. But here's the thing. That's because we only focus on the love of God. Now, the love of God is a wonderful thing. Praise God for his love. I'm so undeserving. I thank him every day for the love that he has shown me, and I love him in return. And all of that is wonderful. But you will have a skewed understanding of God unless you also understand that God is a God of justice. And as a God who is both a God of love and a God of justice, you get solutions to these sort of problems, I think. When God commanded the Israelites to go into Canaan, it wasn't the first time that he had thought about this. These people had been given hundreds of years of God's loving mercy. They could have repented. In Genesis 15:3, it says, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and after they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You'll be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. God lays all this out early on to Abram, what's going to happen. Their iniquity is not complete yet. So we're going to give them hundreds of years. Leviticus 18:24, do not defile yourselves by any of these things. For by all these, the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled, for the land has become defiled. Therefore, I have brought its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. For the men of the land who have been before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become defiled, so that the land will not spew you out should you defile it, as it has spewed out the nation which has been before you. For whoever does any of these abominations, those persons who do so shall be cut off from among their people. Thus, you are to keep my charge, that you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so as not to defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. So what is happening here is a very clear program where God is saying this is what's going to happen. And one day, our God is a God of love and mercy and justice. And so he gives them hundreds of years to repent, these people living in Canaan. And ultimately, though, if he's a good God, remember what we said about Hitler? If God is a good God, he can't just pat these people on the back and tell them, now try to do better. No, instead, he's got to bring justice. And he gave so much time for them to repent. And now he brings justice, and he uses Israel to do it. It seems so harsh when we first hear it, but you understand this power of judgment as a good thing. Love and God's justice through which he brings judgment. And you get a picture of God, a good God. If he's really a good God, then both of those things will end up being in play. But here's the thing. For many people in this life, justice never seems to occur. And even for some people who are misreading situations, it's still their impression that justice never is done with respect to particular individuals. And so they're going to need something else. People in the world today are going to need something else because they don't always see justice done to their enemies. Justice will be done for the abused and the abuser, but not necessarily in this world. There's a God that's coming. He will bring judgment. There will be justice done. Every person who has ever committed a crime that never got caught, every police officer who has ever done wrong by anyone will be caught. Every bad, lying swindling, scandalous politician, justice will be brought. With respect to all of the woes today, all the things that people are crying out about, justice will be brought. This speaks well in the midst of so much talk of racial inequality, by the way. This, by the way, for many people will fit nicely as an answer to the current situation. According to a Pew survey released about a month ago, when adult Americans in general experience suffering, 80% blame people rather than God. 80% of Americans, when they experience suffering, blame people rather than God. And when it comes to what Americans say they feel when hearing about suffering, 71% say it actually makes them thankful for the good that they have. So I know there's an atheist argument from evil that tries to show there is a God because he wouldn't put up with all this pain and suffering and all that. And that is a serious argument that needs to be taken seriously. I just spoke on that in Dallas just a few weeks ago. But when you look at what Americans are thinking about this, 80% blame people rather than God, and 71% say when they hear about suffering, it actually makes them more thankful. Many of them, no doubt, toward God, right? So that's an interesting thing to point out. It actually makes them thankful for the good they have. And 62% say it makes them feel sad for those who are suffering. The vast majority then are not blaming God, but they are upset about things and blame others, not God, for that suffering. Well, if you think other people are responsible and you want it to stop, judgment from God is the answer, because a perfect judge can bring judgment on people that are carrying out wicked acts of injustice. All right, so J is for justice. Now, don't worry, my other points aren't as long as that. But U is for unending life. U is for unending life. Now, this speaks well in the midst of COVID and Afghanistan. And if you're like probably many of us here at this conference that think that abortion is the most wicked thing that we as a nation have put our seal of approval on, then there's a loss of life there as well. A lot is going on. As I said already, 5.41 million COVID deaths worldwide. Why are we treating it so seriously? Because it threatens life, as I've said. That's the reason. People die and people love life. We value life. Life is good. And that yearning Lewis so famously described for fulfillment, that drives him to imagine another world. Well, he's not the only one that thinks about this notion that if I have longings in me, here was Lewis's point. I find in myself thirst. I can go out and I can get something to drink. I can get water. I get hungry. There's food. I have sexual urges. There's a way to alleviate that. There are all these things in here have things that can be met out. They all these desires we have, these yearnings that we have that are a part of the human experience, they have solutions. But I have yearnings in me. Lewis would certainly say pure joy, for example. I have yearnings in me that really nothing in this world ultimately satisfies in a lasting way. So I must have been made for another world. He's not the only one that thinks that way, or at least has considered it. Think about Steve Jobs for a moment. The biographer of Steve Jobs wrote this. He says, I remember sitting in his backyard in his garden one day, and he started talking about God. He, Jobs, said, quote, sometimes I believe in God. Sometimes I don't. I think it's 50-50, maybe. But ever since I've had cancer, I've been thinking about it more, and I find myself believing a bit more. Maybe it's because I want to believe in an afterlife, that when you die, it doesn't all just disappear. The wisdom you've accumulated, somehow it lives on. Then he paused for a second and said, yeah, but sometimes I think it's just like an on-off switch. Click, and then you're gone. Then he paused again and said, and that's why I don't like putting on-off switches on Apple devices, end quote. So he came to the conclusion that it's probably just neurons stop firing, show's over. I'm going to die, that's it. But what if it's not like that? What if his thoughts about, I don't know why it is, but I'm more open to this. Maybe it's just because of the cancer. I don't want to die. I don't want it all to be lost. But what if there is something more than that? According to a 1982 Gallup poll, 5% of the general population of the United States had undergone a near-death experience. This is the point at which some of you are looking at your computer screens right now and rolling your eyes. And I understand, because near-death experiences are often exaggerated. People often speculate. People often this stuff comes up sometimes in the same realm as like psychics and people using like the law of attraction, all these kind of things. But there are some near-death experiences that are veridical and give us some reason to believe that perhaps we survive, that we go on living after death. This is interesting. According to a 1982 Gallup poll, 5% of the general population of the United States had undergone a near-death experience. That was around 8 million people then. Now, 5% is closer to 16.5 million. But according to new data in the US, England, and Europe, there are 30 million cases. 30 million cases. Now, here's what Gary Habermas says about this, and I like it. He says, let's just take away 20 million of those and say you only got 10 million. That's pretty powerful. You gotta answer that. You gotta say something about that. These near-death experiences where people, when they're slipping off into death, or they have no brainwave activity, no heart rate, and they have to be resuscitated, and they later are resuscitated, these people sometimes not only tell us amazing things about another world, and we can't really verify those things necessarily, but what we can do is when they are able to talk about things that they shouldn't know because they were observing it, perhaps, while they had no brainwave or no heart rate or things like that. This is pretty powerful evidence that we survive death and that we are not just our physical body. Pam Reynolds is one that many people know about. It's one of the most famous cases. It's said to be a slam dunk for the notion that we survive death. Pam Reynolds reported many of the heavenly elements that are common among NDEs, that's near-death experiences. Reading from my own book, by the way, Death is a Doorway, if you'd like to pick that up. I'll say what Frank Turek says: all proceeds go to support starving children. Mine. But what catches our attention are the things Pam claims to witness in the operating room when she was in no position to observe them. She describes conversations that she shouldn't have been able to hear or recall. However, her ability to describe what she heard is eclipsed by what she saw. Following the surgery, she was able to describe the unique bone saw that was used during the procedure. She claimed that it, quote, looked like an electric toothbrush, and it had a dent in it, a groove at the top where the saw appeared to go into the handle, but it didn't, and a saw and interchangeable blades too. But these blades were in what looked like a socket wrench case, end quote. Because the bone saw was being used on her head, Pam wouldn't have been able to see it even if she had been conscious. Now, by the way, there's a whole lot going in back and forth in the journal articles about when she had no brainwave activity, when she had no heart rate, when could she really hear something, what was really going on. So one of the arguments is she heard this bone saw and was able to put it together what she was hearing. But this was they were working on her head, and she was unconscious in any case. And hearing it, even if she was totally conscious, how would she be able to reconstruct this bizarre saw and say that it has all these, different pieces that engage with each other like a socket wrench set? How would she know all of that when it's happening on her head and her eyes are closed? She's just hearing it. I don't know. It seems pretty darn powerful, I think. Because the bone saw was being used on her head, Pam wouldn't have been able to see it even if she had been conscious. Some have posited that she may have been able to hear the saw and imagine what it may have looked like. However, the description above is incredibly detailed. It is prohibitively unlikely that she could have guessed its appearance. After all, she was, in everyday terms, dead. Now, The Lancet, which is a respected British medical journal, and The Lancet published an article regarding the patient of Pim van Lamel, MD, a man who had been suffering cardiac arrest and was not breathing, was placed on a ventilator for which his dentures needed to be removed. He was comatose. Over a week later, he awoke and described the room in which he was resuscitated and the individuals present. Moreover, his dentures had gone missing, and he was able to remind the staff that they'd been placed in a crash cart drawer. That was a different room. When he had been in that room, his dentures were removed. He was unconscious. He claimed to have seen the whole thing from outside of his body. The point that I want you to see here is that we actually have some evidence. And when you're talking with someone and you're remembering this acrostic of just, and you've got judgment, unending life, we actually have evidence to support this claim that we have that people are going to survive physical death. And of course, that's very consistent with Christian theism. So I think that's pretty powerful. But I will tell you something of what these people claim to have experienced in this heavenly state that, unfortunately, we can't verify everything about that. But Gary Habermas was speaking at one point to a group of medical professionals, and he was talking about this sort of thing. And at one moment, a woman who was the wife of an ear, nose, and throat doctor stood up and said, "I'll tell you right now, you can stop talking about heaven. I've been there." Well, after a few moments, someone said, "Well, don't just stand there. Tell us about it." And so she said, "Fine. I had 2 sons. I was married to my husband. And I had given birth to, I was giving birth to our 3rd son. But I bled out on the table and was pronounced dead." Now, no, we're not saying she was really dead. with modern medicine, you can come pretty close to that line without crossing it. But she was in a state with no brainwave, no heart rate. And in that state, she said, I can tell you about it. The color, I can tell you about the color. And then she stopped herself and said, no, because when I say color, you're thinking of blue or green or red. And these are colors like, they aren't like that. These are colors like the human eye can't perceive. And she stopped herself and said, I can tell you about the music. The music was just phenomenal. And then she stopped and said, no, because when I say music, you're thinking about Mozart or Beethoven or something. And this was music like you can't imagine. She said, I guess I can't tell you about it. Habermas said, are you convinced you were there? She said, I'm more convinced I was there than I am that I'm here right now. He said, now let me ask you this, and this is perhaps the most telling of all. He said, it's my understanding from women that the bond between a woman and her child is the strongest bond that two humans can have. He said, if you'd had your way, would you have stayed in that place? Or would you have come back to be with your husband and 3 sons, one of which you'd carried for 9 months, but not yet held in your arms? And she looked at the ground and began to weep. And without looking up, she pointed to her husband and said, he could raise our children. I would have never left that incredible place. Now you say, Braxton, did this woman go to heaven? Man, I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you we've got millions of near-death experiences, and we've got many cases where these sorts of things are commonalities. And I can tell you this much, that if people today who are destroyed by what's going on in our culture right now feel that there's no justice and that life feels cheap because of COVID and everything else, well, I can tell you this. We have a guarantor of our salvation within Christianity. We are going to spend eternity with God. And here's the thing. I don't know what that woman experienced or if it was really a heavenly sort of experience, but I can tell you this. In the new heaven and the new earth, what we're going to experience will be 10,000 times greater than what could be put into words. And I think we saw her struggling to put it into words. So U is for unending life, but then S is for satisfaction. The satisfaction we're talking about here is when judgment has come and unending life is on the table, satisfaction will be had. We'll have a perfect king. Think about, as I said before, all the strife over Biden and Trump and did the right people vote, or the people that were allowed to vote? And did people vote more than once? And has there been fraud of some sort? We got to recount and all these sorts of things. Think about all of that over who's going to be our president. The same has happened in other places. People dissatisfied with their kings, their potentates. Here's the thing. We have a God who is a perfect king, a perfect judge. And when we have that, we will have satisfaction. Real peace will be had. Throughout our lives, we're all looking for something to bring us a little satisfaction in life. From cradle to the grave. When we're children, we say, if I can get that gift that I want for Christmas, then I'll be happy. You get that gift? I've got kids. Everybody says it. It's true. 10 minutes after they open the present, they're more happy playing with the box that it came in than they are the present itself. And then they think, well, if I could just get to high school, then I'll be happy. They get to high school. Now they got pimples and homework and there's more problems. Then they say, if I could just get out of school and get that dream job I've always wanted, then I'd be happy. So you get out of school, get that dream job. Now you're really not happy. Then you say something that is crazy. This is crazy. You say, I know I would be happy if I could just get married. Now, usually I'm in an auditorium, and when I say something like that, the old people laugh. And I always say, young people, listen to these old people laughing around you. They're laughing because they know it's true. Marriage doesn't cause problems, but it reveals a ton of problems. And then you say, I know I could just be happy if I could just have a baby. No sooner do you get that kid home from the hospital, but you're already saying, when I can get this kid grown up and out of my house, then I'll finally be happy. Then you say, if I could just retire, I'll be happy. Then if I can just make it to that next check, I'll be happy. Then if I could just see my grandkids a little more often. And your whole life, from the cradle to the grave, you are looking for something to bring you some sort of happiness, something that's lasting. Can I tell you right now? I know this is a conference. I know it's an academic conference. And maybe I'm just preaching now. But Jesus is the only way to real, lasting satisfaction in your life or in my life. It's an amazing thing. And T is for trajectory. This will give us, when we have satisfaction, unending life, and judgment has been done, has been brought, we will have trajectory. We'll have a direction. We'll have somewhere we're heading with all of this. We've hit launch. We've come off the launch pad and we're going somewhere, man. Real, unhindered progress can be made. Can you even imagine Right now, everything we try to do is in the midst of disunity. It makes it almost impossible to get anything done. Politically, that's certainly the case, but it's also true even on a local level. It can even be true in our families. If there's division, it's hard to, but imagine a day when every single human being on the planet is united in doing what the King wants done. Just think of the progress that we can make. And you don't even have to worry about whether he's right or not. He's a perfect king. I mean, this trajectory is an amazing, amazing thing. And as we get to this point in it, I think that's what we really need. I think we need hope, and hope comes with that trajectory. But the thing is, we're never going to have it in this life, not completely. We're never going to have it completely in this life. We get that trajectory from Scripture, and we try to follow it, but there's always disunity around us. It makes it hard. It makes it difficult. Politically, there's disunity, obviously. Here's what I want to do for just a moment. I want to share with you a clip from a young man who's a Black pastor, Black Baptist pastor. And I want you to hear his struggles with the issues that we've been talking about, his community and what's going on there. Just listen.
As I preach to my congregation, I am ever mindful that I'm preaching and teaching to people who lived through segregation and Jim Crow, and some who participated in protest and advocated for change. So I always have in the back of my mind that I'm another link in the chain of progress, and I have this legacy that I get to look at every day to encourage me that yes, it can be done. I've wanted to be a pastor since I was a little boy. It's a pretty significant thing for me to be able to minister in the same city that raised me. In communities like Warren, it's kind of that place where everybody knows everybody. And when you are working with a justice system in a community like that, there's a lot of distrust of the system because you're well aware that the officers, the prosecutors, the judges, the lawyers, they all know each other very well. And in our view, that might affect how tough they're willing to be with one another in matters of justice. There was an incident with a young man of color named Matthew Burrows. He was originally slated to have a court hearing, and that hearing was canceled. And on his way out, an officer of the court attempted to stop him in regards to another matter, and Matthew chose to flee the scene and go home. A chase ensued, and as Matthew pulled into the apartment complex where he lived, neighbors and witnesses described a sort of slow standoff that culminated in a very quick firing of weapons by Now's police officers, resulting in his death. Many feel that he was not a threat to the officers at all. So we've been fighting all year long for the officers to be held accountable for their actions. Unfortunately, our Trumbull County prosecutor decided not to pursue charges, and the grand jury did not indict those officers. I've always had a positive view of law enforcement. I was taught to respect police officers and judges. At the same time, I'm always cognizant that there are those who don't always respect all people the same way. I worry that our community will give in to despair. I worry that sometimes we can get so stuck in the successes of the past that we don't see the promise of the future. In some areas of our city, it's often seen as violent or crime-ridden or rankled by drug activity, and while those things do exist, it's really not the prominent story of our community. We really do have a wide swath of individuals who are working in community organizations, churches, students who are excelling, and we're not just another Rust Belt city that doesn't have any hope or any promise. I think it's vital for young people to be a bridge with the historical knowledge that we have. When I'm letting some young person know that they really do have a future ahead of them, and I'm letting some older person know that their best days really aren't behind them, that's when I feel the most free.
This impressive young man is trying to look at what's going on in his community and do ministry in the midst of that, while keeping in mind the cultural things that are plaguing the people with which he is doing ministry. And I just want us to look now. It doesn't matter whether I don't really know this guy personally. I'm listening to him, I'm hearing them. But if you think he's wrong about something, it doesn't matter. We're asking the question: would this acrostic of just, judgment, unending life, satisfaction, trajectory, would this bring hope in a situation like the one described here by this young man in his context? Well, looking at the words of this young pastor, does God's justice in light of this acrostic measure up? Well, there is an imperfect system, according to what he says, that has led to injustices. The Black community wants justice to be brought on the guilty, judgment to be brought on the guilty. That judgment should be sought in this life, but perfect judgment may not come until God judges. But the abused can rest assured that the sin of such individuals will receive penalty under the judgment of God, who, by the way, has a perfect system. Looking at this young man, he desires that for even the older individuals, that they understand that their best days are not behind them, but in front of them. This is simply not going to be the case for many in this demographic, at least not before the resurrection. But one day we will experience all the life we could ever want, and even COVID won't stand in the way of that. So one day we are going to have that life. With satisfaction, he says his people struggle with despair for the injustices, loss of life, and lack of judgment. But with a perfect king, that satisfaction with life will happen. And he talks about the community, what the community could be when these senseless divisions aren't present, because everyone recognizes Jesus as king. A real trajectory toward real progress can be made. Now, if this was a sermon, I'd leave it right there. 4 points. Let's go home. But this is a conference, and I want to give you a little more something a little more to take with you to talk to people, aside from just good reason to believe that there's everlasting life and a good acrostic to share the hope that we have in light of judgment that, yes, involves heaven and hell and all of that. But I want to actually give you an argument for the afterlife. It's not a complex argument, and this argument is for someone who already believes in God but hasn't embraced Christianity. And I think this argument works well. By the way, there are a lot of people in the world who are not Christians but do believe in God. And I think that this can be helpful as far as that is concerned. So let's take a look at this argument together. Here's a brief case for the afterlife. A good God exists. Okay? For someone who doesn't accept that, we might have to argue for that, or this might not be the person you want to use this argument with. But if one does believe that a good God exists, I think this argument runs. A good God will ensure justice is brought. Now, is that a controversial premise? Well, we may not have Cartesian certainty about how all that would play out, but the fact is, if we have a good God, we've already established that judgment and justice is a good thing, well, then a good God will ensure justice is brought. But justice is not always brought in this life for the abused or the abuser. Therefore, God will enact justice after death. I think this is a very simple way for anyone who believes that there is a good God to get to the afterlife, to come to believe that there is an afterlife. Now, in terms of actually getting to the afterlife, we want you to place your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for the sin of the world. If you'll trust in him and repent of your sin, which means to turn from your life without Jesus to a life with Jesus, then we can spend eternity in heaven forever with him on that trajectory, upward, going somewhere, full humanity united in the progress toward what our King wants. What an amazing thing. The opposite of that is you will not have eternity with God, but you will experience hell, however one understands the nature of hell. And to that end, I just want to say this. I think the most important thing that we can tell people, we can tell them that all of this makes sense. We can give the apologetics that I've discussed today. We can use the acrostic and explain that Jesus meets all of the desires they have, the yearnings, the deep yearnings regarding what's going on in our culture right now. We can do all of that. The most important thing we can ask of those around us when we're having conversations like this, and no conversation with an unbeliever, I can't end one without sharing this. The most important thing is that we share with them how to be there one day. To be there. Be where? Be with us. Don't go to hell. Choose life that you may live, you and your descendants, right? We want them to choose life. Just be there. I'll say this and I'll be done, but my father has a rare genetic blood disease, and because of that blood disease, he, if he gets a tooth knocked out, he could bleed to death. If he falls and scrapes his knee, he could bleed to death. He has this von Willebrand's disease, worse than anyone who has made it to his stage in life. Most people that have it as bad as he has it die much earlier. They bleed and die. My father had to take 120 pints of blood when he was 15 years old at one time, and I recall us having to drive states and states away to get to the right doctor when my father bit his tongue and nearly bled to death. And so it was tough. Growing up, I was always told your dad might not be here in a couple of years. And you can imagine my terror when finally I had my high school graduation, and my father the next week was going for open heart surgery open heart surgery on a man with that kind of bleeding disease. He has said to me and my brother that he had asked God to let him live long enough to see both of his sons graduate high school. I was the second son with diploma in hand. And so I thought my dad was going to die. In fact, the doctors told us there was like a 60% chance he was going to die. And I remember sitting next to his bed and my father saying to my mother, my brother, myself, Marilyn, Braxton, Chad, I don't know really about anyone else in this world that they're really saved. I know that about me. And I know that I'm going to be there one day. And my dying wish, if that's what happens for each of you, he said, just be there. Just be there. I'm going to be there one day. Would you just be there? My father survived that day. I remember I sat by his bed while he was in surgery and opened his Bible. And on the inside cover of his Bible, he had written, God always keeps his promises. God hadn't promised my dad would survive that day, but he did. And the first thing my dad said to me when he came out was he said, son, roteers, roteers. Now, you might think maybe that's an ancient language. That's a word from Greek or Hebrew or something, and it means something really, profound or something. No, roteers was the greasiest burger joint hole-in-the-wall burger joint in Nashville, Tennessee. It was about 4 blocks from the hospital where we were at, and it was freezing and raining like crazy. I walked through the freezing rain to get a Roteers cheeseburger for my dad, and I was as happy as I could be to do it because I love him. But you know what? God always keeps his promises. I wasn't promised my dad would survive that day, as I say, but I was promised that all the things we've been discussing are going to be true. There's going to be a judgment from a just judge. We're going to have an unending life. We don't have to worry about my dad dying then or any of the death that's happening with COVID or anything else. We'll all be satisfied, a satisfaction that we've never experienced here on earth. And that will allow a trajectory to make happen what should happen, what the King wants, when everyone on earth is united in that project. It's been a joy speaking with you today. Thank you all for having me.